Hi, my name's Dr. Elaine Smith, and I'm a clinical psychologist and business wellbeing consultant. Today, I'm going to take you through a small training on creating more psychological safety in your meetings at work. So, if you're a leader, a CEO, or a senior manager in your workplace and you regularly chair meetings, I would encourage you to have a look at this and see what you can do to improve on your practice. Okay. Okay. So, from mediocre to meaningful, how can you enhance psychological safety in meetings at work? Because meetings without psychological safety, we could say, are just meetings about meetings. They achieve less. Sometimes people go away feeling discouraged, feeling unmotivated. So, to get the most out of your meetings, we're going to talk about how we can enhance psychological safety in them. So, first of all, what is psychological safety? Amy Edmondson has done a lot of research in this area, and this is one of her definitions. In a psychologically safe workplace, people are not hindered by interpersonal fear. They feel willing and able to take the inherent interpersonal risks of candour. They fear holding back their full participation more than they fear sharing a potentially sensitive, threatening, or wrong idea. The fearless organisation is one in which interpersonal fear is minimised so that the team and organisational performance can be maximised in a knowledge-sensitive world. It is not one devoid of anxiety about the future. Okay. And one of the conversations that sometimes comes out about psychological safety is that it's fluffy or it's a case of just being nice, and it's really not anything to do with that. It's about people being able to feel honest and transparent and safe to express whatever they think needs expressed in the workplace. And actually, psychological safety is at least equally beneficial for the organisation as it is for the individual. Okay, when we think about the whole context and what it can do, and we'll talk about that in a little while. Okay, so in a nutshell then, in a psychologically safe workplace, people will feel safe, engaged in their work, they'll feel seen, they'll feel happy at work, they'll feel valued, they'll feel motivated, they feel ready to learn, able to challenge the status quo, and feel more productive. All sounds pretty good. And the good news is that there's simple steps towards employees feeling psychologically safe. It isn't rocket science, but it does require some reflective work and sometimes take a look at ourselves and our practice and see what we can change. And the actual act of doing that and explaining to your team or your colleagues why you're doing that, you're actually establishing psychological safety in the process as well. Okay. So I just want you to picture this for a moment. You're sitting in a meeting, waiting for it to start. Your boss walks in a few minutes late and is obviously in a bad mood. They slam down their diary and papers and whisper to the colleague next to them. Then they look up and say, "Right, let's start," in an angry tone. In this meeting, you've been asked to give a short presentation and to chair part of the meeting. You feel yourself getting anxious and constantly scanning the environment. It feels hostile and it feels difficult to concentrate. A colleague asks a question and your boss meets this with a short, sharp, and rude response. You notice that many people in the meeting are looking to the floor and are contributing very little. You do your presentation with no public thanks from your boss. They don't acknowledge it. They criticise a couple of your points, and colleagues who you know disagree with your boss's stance do not support you publicly in the meeting. They come up to you afterwards and comment on the atmosphere and attitude of your boss in the meeting. Okay, just want you to imagine that you might have experienced that. It might bring up some memories. But I just want you to think about how you might feel if you're lucky enough that you haven't experienced that. Okay. Okay. So obviously that is not a psychologically safe meeting. Okay. So let's think about how would you feel in that meeting? Okay. When it's very, very tense, mistakes are not welcome. There doesn't seem an awful lot of warmth, if any warmth and compassion. How does it affect your behaviour? How are you different in that meeting compared to somebody coming in who feels very non-threatening and non-judgmental? What are you likely to do or not do as a result of that? And how does it impact on the purpose of the meeting? How does it impact on how effective that meeting is? Because it's still taking up the same amount of time for everybody. And meetings, we know, eat up a lot of time in organisations, so we must use them well. How does the experience impact on working relationships? It's really important because we're human beings, so as soon as we walk out of that meeting or as soon as the meeting ends, the impact doesn't. There'll be some kind of hangover from it. Okay, and it can impact people on different levels. Really important to consider. Some people might ruminate about that for some time after. And does it impact on your motivation and productivity? I can imagine that it's not going to encourage people to work harder or have confidence. Okay, those types of experiences can be quite damaging. And one of the things we try to avoid the most as human beings is any form of public humiliation. And from that description, it sounds like that sort of criticism in front of colleagues in an unsafe environment can also really negatively impact people as well. We can have criticism in a compassionate way, but criticism in that type of environment that I described can definitely negatively impact. So what are the other implications of creating hostile, psychologically unsafe working environment? We're looking at meetings specifically, but even more generally, okay? Employees tend to feel undervalued, and with repeated experiences of psychologically unsafe interactions, that can lead to employees looking for a job elsewhere, okay? Therefore reducing employee retention, okay? Motivation drops, and so does productivity. There can be an impact on mood, mental health, and overall culture. Obviously, it depends on the individual. If somebody's already feeling a bit fragile, or already having mood or anxiety difficulties, you can imagine it can really exacerbate that. Employees might not speak highly of their company or leaders to others and would not recommend working there, so a form of reputational damage. And time is wasted in the meeting itself, but also beyond because of these additional consequences above. So people might actually be less productive following the meeting. And obviously how people feel is everything. It's the basis of success in every industry. Okay. So what is the impact of psychological safety at work? Why does it even matter? What is the point? Okay. First of all, it's all about relationships. Okay, relationships. It's about leadership. It's about employee well-being. It's about employee engagement, productivity, meetings culture, staff retention. Really huge. It minimises the likelihood of catastrophic mistakes because people speak up about concerns early on. And it also feeds into learning, development, and growth. Because if we feel safe enough to learn and ask questions, we're going to get way more from that experience than if we feel silenced or met with very hostile, short, sharp, humiliating responses, we're going to stop asking. We're going to stop going there. Of course we are. Okay. So psychologically safe workplaces can impact all of these areas, all of them, and ultimately impact on how successful the organisation's output is, whatever the services or products they deliver. Okay. So there are 4 main stages of psychological safety, and this is Tim Clark's model. So you don't have to worry about it as such. We'll go into a little bit more detail after. It's just to know about it at this stage, okay? The first is inclusion safety. The second is learner safety. The third, contributor safety. And the fourth is challenger safety, okay? And here's just a little bit on the numbers. The Gallup report from 2022 says that only 9% of the current workforce are engaged in their work. Okay, and employee engagement refers to how employees feel at their work, how much they perhaps enjoy it, how passionate they are. You know, it's all about what they bring. You know, if we're fully engaged in something, we bring a lot more, and we're probably better at it, and our mental health is probably better as a result. Employee engagement is crucial for businesses to retain staff and to remain profitable. Okay, it's been kind of wholehearted, it's been able to bring our whole selves to work. Okay, so do you think your staff feel they can bring their whole selves to work and still feel supported? Do you think they feel they have to leave part of themselves at home? Is there part of themselves that's not welcome in your organisation? And these are some of the tougher questions when we have to self-reflect and maybe acknowledge the more difficult things in organisations as a way of moving forward. Amy Edmondson also talks about dangerous silence. Okay, so she has written a lot about how silence leads to catastrophic failure at times, and there are many examples of this. Okay, so she says a culture of silence is a dangerous culture. There are many examples, and this is just one. So in 2003, there was a launch of the Columbia shuttle by NASA where 7 astronauts tragically died. Okay, and as always in these tragic events, there's an investigation. And this particular investigation uncovered that an engineer did not feel safe enough to speak up in a meeting about their concerns. They said, I just couldn't do it. I'm too low down in the organisation. And she, referring to the mission management team leader, Linda Ham, she's way up there. So referred to himself as down here, and the team leader as way up there. Okay, so there was something that engineer saw that was a warning sign that something could go wrong, but that engineer didn't feel they could speak up about their concerns. And often when one thing goes wrong, there's a snowball effect, particularly in some industries. And obviously when we can see in NASA, and it actually led to a tragic event happening. And obviously that's a more extreme example, but it is an example of why psychological safety is so important in organisations. We want people to speak up, even if it means creating more work, losing money in the short term. We're thinking about people's health and well-being. We're thinking about all the possible consequences when things go wrong. And on balance, if you were to ask everybody involved in that incident how they would play it now, could be pretty sure they would want that engineer to speak up. So just a little bit more about these key stages, and you can just think of these as a guide whenever you're thinking about psychological safety in the workplace. So inclusion safety is basically about feeling accepted, included, and welcomed. Okay, so how do we acknowledge people? How do we interact with them? How do we help them feel seen, not forgotten about, not ignored, especially in a world of hybrid working? I think it's even more important. It's easier for people to hide either consciously or unconsciously when they're working remotely. Learner safety then, feeling safe to ask questions and make mistakes. Because of course, if we're going to learn, we're going to make mistakes and we're going to want to ask questions. That's the whole process. But we have to know that during that process, there aren't going to be negative implications for us. There's not going to be humiliation. We're not going to be made to feel bad, and it's not going to negatively impact on our mental health at a minimum. Contributor safety then, feeling able to contribute and participate without fear, people being able to be themselves while being professional, obviously, but being able to sort of freely, for example, brainstorm, share some of the first ideas that come into their mind, that they don't feel like they have to have it all right before they contribute, because they feel like it's okay, they're not going to be laughed at, they're not going to be punished in any way for coming up with something that's not perfect. And challenger safety then, feel able to challenge how the team works, how the organisation works and the behaviours of others. And again, crucial for preventing often catastrophic mistakes. Okay, so the challenger safety as well is really, really important. When we see something we don't like, we don't agree with, that breaks boundaries, rules, even the law, that people ideally should feel able to challenge those things. Because what we know is if they're not challenged in the earlier stages by people within the organisation, the likelihood is that it'll come out in some other way via a mistake with a product, health and safety concern, getting the media. It'll get out further down the line if these mistakes keep getting made. And of course, no organisation wants that and no individual wants that. So if we can provide an environment where things can be challenged earlier on, we can prevent those more serious things from happening further down the line. Okay, so here are some ideas of how you can action more psychologically safe meetings the next time you go to chair a meeting, or whatever it is that you're doing, maybe with a group of staff. That sort of applies to group work as well. But whenever you're in a meeting type or training type scenario, these are just a few tips, okay? Encourage short introductions. Introductions are important, but it's fine that they just say, hi, my name is. We don't need an interesting fact. It depends. We can add that in, but we don't need it. We just need everybody to be on that sort of equal footing, and it's important that people know each other's names, of course. And it depends if it's a regular meeting or more irregular where people don't know each other, but it's a good way to start anyway. But without that sense of creeping death or that it's a big deal. Just very matter of fact. Everybody say, hi, my name is. They might want to say their job title, but I wouldn't put a lot of pressure on much more information because some people find that really anxiety provoking. So for regular meetings, say with your team each week, each month, I think it's really important to establish shared understanding of the meeting rules as such, that even the unwritten rules, but they have been explored explicitly. So for example, ensuring people understand they can go to the toilet anytime, boundaries around phone use during the meeting, expectations around participation, etc. And this depends so much on what type of work you do, about the size of your team, about the nature of it, about the culture, etc. But I just think in general, it's good there's a shared understanding and that there are boundaries around meetings. We actually do like boundaries. We might push up against them sometimes, but we generally really benefit from boundaries so that everybody knows what's expected of them. And of course, it makes the meetings more effective and efficient. If you are chairing the meeting, acknowledge your own feelings if you're a bit anxious, if you're late, stressed, harassed, if you forget something. So if this is modelled by senior members of staff, others are far more likely to share their inner experiences. And this is what we now know. If we perceive that somebody has it all together, or this, we sort of put a leader or a boss on a pedestal and believe that, they don't make mistakes, or, sort of put them on the path to perfection, we don't feel like we can fully relate. So I think it's really important that anybody in a leadership position can express their own vulnerabilities, and we know that opens the door for other people in the organisation to also just talk about how they're feeling, and that is one of the keys to psychological safety. Ensure you have an agenda and clear framework for the meeting, like most people probably do, but people do usually appreciate that there's some kind of guide and purpose to the meeting. People also like to know if there's going to be a break if it's a particularly long meeting, or even if it's not, if there's going to be a break. I suppose this depends if it's virtual or face-to-face as well, but it goes regardless. It's important regardless. People feel much more settled when they know that they can eat, get a drink, or go to the toilet at a certain time. I think basic human needs, really. And this is something I always set out during any training that I facilitate. I always make sure that we have the breaks in at the start. I've sat in so many training courses over the years thinking I'm not focusing because either I'm thinking I need to go to the toilet or I'm getting too hungry. And I think that's just human nature. And if we know time, I think it helps people settle in a bit more and feel a lot more relaxed in the environment. If appropriate and useful, I also think it's important to use small groups to encourage peer learning and support where possible. And this is particularly thinking about that sort of learning step when you think about the 4 steps to psychological safety. People can really benefit from smaller groups to feel more able to share, to practice sharing, and to ask questions maybe before it goes to the larger group. So that can be really beneficial as well for people. Encourage questions in the meeting by paying close attention to any sort of initial questions you get, because how you respond to initial questions will set the tone, and you could almost predict if you're going to get asked other questions, which is what we want to encourage. Okay, so if you pay close attention to each question with a compassionate response, no matter what people ask. Okay, now in an extreme case where it's inappropriate, of course, that would need to be sort of addressed. But we're talking about letting any questions in other than that. And even if they trigger you, you feel annoyed or you feel irritated, that we must meet people compassionately. We can try to understand it later, but it's not just the implication for that person asking, it's the implication for everybody else who's watching that interaction and the impact of that, okay? Acknowledge and thank people for all their contributions. It does take courage, doesn't it? It's sometimes easier to stay quiet if we're honest. The response we get heavily influences how we will engage at the next meeting. If we're shut down, humiliated, ignored, not followed up if they said they would, we remember those things well, the stronger the emotional impact it has at the time on us, the more we'll remember it and hold on to it if it's not processed, if it's not talked about, if it's not talked through. So it's really important. Everybody's watching what's going on and taking that as a cue to how they can interact. Okay. And as I said earlier on, as humans, we avoid public humiliation at all costs. So we must appreciate when someone puts themselves in a vulnerable position in front of their peers. Peers are also the group that we feel most vulnerable amongst generally. So it's really something to think about. That's just a few tips for how to manage and create more psychologically safe meetings and working environments sort of in general. Okay. And there's one more. Make space for people to challenge organisational processes and current difficulties. And it can feel uncomfortable at first, but with practice and consistency, it will begin to feel easier because it'll become a part of the process. Everybody will expect it. Everybody will have seen before how things are handled. So it becomes a safe space to have uncomfortable conversations. We're not shying away from anything that's difficult. We're just making sure that there's a suitable, safe place for people to have those conversations. Remembering all the while that this is actually a preventative way of making sure that organisation doesn't have catastrophic mistakes, reputational damage, or anything like that. You're thinking this is a preventative way of working. And that's why it can feel a bit uncomfortable, because if it's not uncomfortable now, we can guess it'll probably be uncomfortable later and a lot more serious later on. Okay. So a little bit more about me and how you can work with me. So I offer training and consultancy on all things mental health and well-being to financial services organisations. And my signature program is called the Triangle of Corporate Wellbeing, and I focus on three main courses, which is first of all, about leaders' mental health and well-being, because I think we need psychologically healthy leaders in order to be able to look after the rest of their employees. Okay, we can't expect somebody who's really struggling themselves to look after the mental health of others. So leaders' mental health and well-being is really key and really important. Then we go on to compassionate leadership, and then specific training on harnessing psychological safety at work, which you've had a little taster of today, but a lot more in depth for the full training. I also provide bespoke and off-the-shelf digital products to support mental health at work. I've got a whole series of posters, and I can create bespoke digital products as well when asked. I also sell pre-recorded courses, and I also offer one-to-one sessions with leaders to support any issues around work-related stress and burnout, or those who just want to invest in their own mental health from a preventative way. Okay. There's some of my contact details there. You can also look on my website. Feel free, email is probably the best way of getting in contact with me. It's drelaine.smith@protonmail.com. Okay, so thank you for joining me for the training. I really appreciate that. And I will see you again if you choose to get in touch. And thank you for